Obviously, also don't want to miss any details. All right, so we'll cover this hand then. So this was played at 25. As you see, there's a 3 cent. So that's there's a 3 cent rake or rake ante, which changes things quite a bit, makes everybody much looser. I don't think it will make people as loose as this should be, so I'm not going to take that dynamic into account as much. Okay, so pocket kings here. We are still pawn star. We 3-bet in the small lines against Toma, against the cutoff. Okay, fine. And we see a 9-8-5 flop. Okay, so first off, this is a board on which you should do a lot of checking, right? Which, again, this is not a flop seminar. This is a river seminar. But again, guys, the flop impacts the river, right? Let's say you check. So here, this is a great example for you, Stefan. If, let's say, we check full range, so clearly we have a betting range because we did actually bet. So if we have a betting range, it removes the amount of flushes we can have if we, let's say, check, right? Because, I mean, flush is a good hand to bet with, a hand that generally has no showdown value. So we would often want to bet then, or at least sometimes. So if we check full range on the flop, it means that on the flush completing run out, we have every single flush, right? But now that we have got a betting range, it means it removes some flushes. If, let's say, we check full range on the flop, it means that on the turn, we have all of the nut straights with Jack 10. Whereas now that we've bet, that's not the case anymore, right? So I would probably end up checking my full range in this spot. In position, we'll probably have pocket 9s and pocket 8s 100% of the time, 7-6 suited 100% of the time, pocket 5s perhaps, 9-8 perhaps, and obviously we'll have flush shows and overcards and whatnot. So this is it's not the worst spot to check your range in, actually. So the point is, guys, here, let's say we bet like half the time, which is too much, but half the time. And let's say we bet half our flush draws, right? That means on the river, we have half as many flushes as we would have if, let's say, when check, full range, and then we would start betting, right? So that's what you have to be careful of. So we bet the flop small, which is definitely correct if we're going to bet. We check the queen turn, okay. Probably mostly would want to bet, but okay, fine. And on the river deuce. So we end up betting, a little bit under 3/4 pot. So on this river, right, I would say we get to employ also big bets. I mean, it's this is a very tricky mixed strategy. As I said, I think we mostly should have ended up checking range on we should have ended up checking range on the river. On the flop. But on this river, when villain doesn't stab in position, I mean, there's 2 flush draws and a million straight draws and a million relevant pairs and whatnot, right? This is not a board in which villain will check behind with a ton of nutted hands. So on the river, pocket kings is actually virtually the nuts. So it's also a spot where we checked a lot of really strong hands on the turn because we're afraid and want to pot control whatnot. So on the river, we have a lot of strong hands. So this would probably be a really tricky combination of block bets, 3/4 pot bets, which is what we employed, and even a few shoves. The problem is that we're making really complicated now because, again, we have a mixed strategy on a really tricky board, right? So, but the point is, if we check full range on the flop, it means that on the turn, well, we would have 4 combinations of Jack 10 suited. Let's say villain would have like 2 of them. He always calls pre-flop, and maybe he stabs like 2 of them on the flop. Maybe he stabs 3 of them. So we would have an advantage, right? When it comes to like sets on the flop, we would check all the 9s and all of the 8s. And villain would mostly bet, but again, sometimes check. So we would have the advantage. We've checked full range. We've checked all of our strong hands, or hands that are now strong on the queen or the deuce run out. Right, so we get to be quite aggressive. And so when you go with the bet, check, bet, just ask yourself, guys, like, how capped is villain? Villain in this spot is quite capped because imagine you're in this spot, right? Let's say you've got a set or 2 pair or straight or whatnot. You'd often just bet. This board is insanely draw heavy. So when you check behind, it just really looks like in position as like 10-9 suited, 8-7 suited, queen 10, pocket jacks, maybe that type of stuff. So I'd say villain is quite capped, and therefore we can employ big bets. So guys, if let's say you don't have a lot of strong hands, and the strong hands are just the nuts that don't get any calls, then block betting makes more sense. But in this spot, you clearly have more strong hands, so I would definitely want to see you bet big. So overall, I do like this river sizing. How would you bet on the flop? On the turn if you check on the flop. That depends on the card, David. So if you check your full range on the flop, it means you still got all of the good stuff on the flop or hands that are now good on turn or river, right? So you'd want to bet pretty aggressively. So let's say we check full range and the turn is an ace or a king. We can bet quite aggressively. If the turn is, let's say, a 5, a 4, or a 3, or a deuce, we can bet quite aggressively. If the turn brings a straight, like a 6 or 7, we'd be much more careful. On a 9 or an 8, we're more careful. On a queen, it's a little bit closer, right? On a jack, it's a little bit closer. On a 10, it's a bit closer. So basically, David, ask yourself how good the card is for you. If the card is very good, we can be quite aggressive. Could we use a block bet or shove strategy? That is possibly a great play, August. Yeah, that could be a great play. Do high stakes guys really check back SETA at some frequencies versus our range check on the flop? Absolutely, Amar. Again, we're playing NL25, right? Obviously, no disrespect to NL25, but people who play much higher stakes are going to play a bit better. So they do a better job of, again, mixing it up and being unpredictable. And if we go back to, that's what you said in the beginning, right? What does it say right here? Mixing it up, become unpredictable. As you see, these things are all tied in. And then we talk about, what if my opponent doesn't do any of that? Where was that? Let me go back for a sec. What if my opponents don't apply any pressure? Well, that's what we're talking about now. But in the opposite direction, not what if my opponents don't apply any pressure? What if my opponents never check back good hands, right? Every time they got a good hand, they just bet. That means that we have to apply more pressure when they don't show any strength because they just don't have any good hands, right? Oops, sorry, I'm just going wild here. So as you see, I'm all of these concepts are, intertwined. Is that the word? They're all, they all add up together as one large concept, right? You have to add all of these concepts, combine all of these concepts, and then you'll end up with, the right strategy. How much do we check raise this flop when checking range? That's a good question. It's a bit unrelated. We would check raise at like a medium frequency, Yuri. But the point is, if we check range, guys, that affects your river range, right? Which goes back to the beginning of the PowerPoint presentation. If we check range, then on the flush runout, we have all the flushes. If we bet range, or let's say if we bet mixed, we won't have as many of the flushes. We won't have as many of the sets, of the straights, whatnot. So think about how that impacts the hand. And the more nutted hands you've got, and the more capped your opponent is, the more you want to lean towards that overbet shove, as August asked. Right? How much do you bet on the queen of diamonds on the turn? I'll probably bet for a large sizing, David, at like a medium frequency. So yeah, at this point we would bet and check raise a bit of everything, David. It's a very complicated mixed strategy, but that's a bit of a topic for another day. Even with flop being really good for imposition, do you think pop will stab too much? I would guess that at mostly at between 25 and 200 NL, most people just stab too much. And the reason they stab is because they're uncomfortable playing later streets, but they also stab too much, which is correct because villains don't check strong enough. So if you were to bet most of your strong hands on this flop, then when you check, your weak hands, villain gets to bet a lot, right? But then if we check range, villain doesn't get to bet a lot. Guys, in basically every spot, if people check range on the flop, which is obviously, it's difficult to know whether or not they will, you respond by being quite tight. If villain bets most of his good hands, then you get to be much looser. Would you recommend jamming the river with some nutted hands on the river at micro and low stakes? I feel like they have full range there. So let's say that's true, Mark. So what you'd want to do is, if your opponent's way overfold against huge aggression, what you'd want to do is introduce that large sizing more often, right? And just be overly bluff heavy. Now, would you never ever shove for value? No. No, definitely not. So guys, don't say I'm never going to bluff, I'm always going to bluff. Those concepts are not correct. Okay? So what I would say is over bluff, right? So let's say we shove twice the pot. That means that villain gets 40% equity, 40% on his money. So we need to be bluffing around 40%. If you believe that villain calls way too tight, then you should be bluffing way more often, right? Sure. If you believe that villain is a huge calling station, what do we do then? If you believe villain is a huge calling station, it means we can bet bigger for value, right? Because some hands that are normally block bets are just worth more money. And then block bets don't get any folds. So then maybe we would remove the block bet strategy and we go for more like 3/4 and all in, right? So yeah, guys, I mean, if you say guys are big calling stations, bet bigger on average and bet more thinly for value. If they are way too tight, especially way too tight against big bets, obviously you get to be tighter against big bets because you're getting a worse price, then, introduce that big sizing and become more bluff heavy, right? So just take hands like, in this spot, for instance, take hands like whatever, king 10 suited or ace 10 suited, whatnot, and start turning them into a bluff by shoving. Something just fell in the kitchen. I'm sorry about that. That was not my doing. I'm still behind the computer, I promise. I know that some guys call lighter to big bets. Well, they should. I mean, they have to put in more money to win, right? So obviously they get to fold more. I mean, you can plug this into Pio. Just find any sim. I mean, bet third pot on the flop or bet full pot on the flop. You'll see that against full pot. They obviously call less often. You got to put in more money to win. So don't forget that, right? So obviously, I mean, it's obviously difficult to say if people still overfold against those big bets. They're not ghosts, I promise you. So let's talk about those adjustments against weaker players for a bit. Okay. So as I said, thinner value bets are in order, right? And in a lot of spots, like that pocket tens, in that pocket tens example, your hand was only worth a third of the pot. But if your opponent is way too loose, you can just go thinner for value, and even use a larger sizing, which is most likely going to be point number 2 or 3. How do you figure out if your opponent is loose? Well, look at the player pool you're playing in. Are they very loose in general? I've reviewed some of my students on Bodog where people are extremely loose with calls. Whereas then if you look at a nittier lineup like Stars, I would imagine they're a little bit tighter, right? You can look at your opponent's statistics as well. When to showdown is my favorite stat. One money at showdown is going to be a question by at least one person now. I would not recommend using the one money at showdown stat. We can go into that another time, but long story short, I would not recommend it. One more soft flop is important, and mostly when to showdown. So obviously, if when to showdown is higher, you go to showdown more often, and the only way you do it is by not folding, right? So your opponent is just less likely to fold. Also, make sure to look at full to river bet, full to river C bet, full to river probe, whatever river stats you've got. How often is he folding rivers? Be careful. When it comes to river stats, you need a significant sample. Obviously, we see way more pre-flop action, flop action, turn action, and river action. So you're least likely to have a large river sample, right? So be careful. If somebody folded 2 out of 2 times, that doesn't mean that he's overfolding, right? Maybe he just had enough. Maybe he just had a missed flush shot 2 out of 2 times, and you would have folded as well, right? That doesn't mean he's a calling station or a folding station if that's a thing. So be careful. You need a bit of a bigger sample. But yeah, look at your opponent's stats, and the looser they are, the more thinly you can value bet. If we're talking about recreational players, as in fish, right? How do fish play? Let's break that down. So I would say over 80% of fish play like this. They play too many hands pre-flop, as in their VPIP is quite high. They don't tend to 3-bet that much. So their 3-bet is on the lower side, and their PFR is on the lower side as well. So for instance, a very standard fish would be somebody who plays like 38, 14, 6, right? As in 38 VPIP, which is, not insane, but too loose. 14 PFR, as in they do a lot of limping, they do a lot of overcalling, they don't do as much raising themselves, and then 6% 3-bet. They mostly 3-bet their good hands, and once in a while they'll 3-bet like a bluff or like just a really random spastic hand because they feel like it, right? And then what they do post flop is they tend to be not extremely aggressive. They tend to just want to hit something, right? And then they generally fast play, but they can be tricky. And then what fish also notoriously do is they don't like to fold. They play too many hands, and when you play too many hands, you on average don't have a very good one. So when you finally have a very good hand or a pretty good hand, you're not looking to fold, right? So against recreational players, make thinner value bets and also make larger bets, right? If you want to get them to fold, you need to bet large, and also you're going to be able to value bet more thinly. You can also introduce smaller sizes, which are almost exclusively for value against fish. What you'll see is if you bet like small, like a please call me bet, you'll see that fish fold virtually nothing. Because they just see, oh, I'm betting, I'm calling $3. Hey, I make $12 an hour in my job. I can call this bet, right? Whereas if you put them to the test and shove all in, at least then they'll tighten up because they might know that it's the last money in their account or whatnot, or they really don't want to lose everything. So if I bluff against fish, I tend to prefer larger sizings. And my smaller bets tend to be quite value heavy against fish, right? Obviously, against a standard fish, against a guy who's kind of loose and passive and, just doesn't really like to fold much once he's got a pretty good hand. And the next thing, which is so important, guys, we talk so much about Pio and Bluff the Spot, and it's so important to know about Pio Solver and improve your understanding of the game. But that's great for improving your knowledge and especially outplaying regulars, but we're still trying to make most of our money against fish, right? And that means you should not outplay yourself. Don't go for too many like counterfeit, blocker, full house, bluff, raise, jam, whatnot plays, okay? Yes, these plays are theoretically correct sometimes, but we're now assuming that our opponent folds the majority of our range, right? And folds even quite a few strong hands. But if Villain doesn't do that, if he just snap call, like low calls one pair, then you just look stupid, okay? So against recreational players, keep it simple, okay? Keep it simple. Exploit the fact that they play too many hands and therefore they will have too many weak flush draws versus your strong flush draws. They'll have too many top pair bad kickers versus your good kickers. They'll have too many gut shots versus your open enders. You are going to play stronger hands than they will. Right? And because of that, you can make quite a few thin value bets and you can push them around. And they'll just be either forced to fold, which they end up not doing, or they'll end up calling and end up losing. Right? And that, you see that again, you see that back in the one to showdown and whatnot. So keep it simple against fish. If you're a good player and your opponent's a bad player, keep it simple, right? If you guys are forced to play against OTB Red Baron or Linus Love or any of those really, really good players, you cannot go for these very simplistic adjustments because these guys will see right through that. But against a recreational player, keep it simple, right? Don't be afraid to give away a little bit of a timing tell or a bet size tell or be a bit more inconsistent, make some more vacuum plays. The bigger the fish, the more you should adjust, okay? And guys, remember this. Obviously, we're all here to make money from poker, right? You guys are probably going to be better than some of the regs, maybe worse than some of them. But the point is, against regulars, you're quite competitive, right? You're never going to destroy them. If you play, if you're an NL25 reg and your opponent is an NL25 reg, you're not going to be that much worse or better than him. But you can be way, way, way better against recreational players. That's where most of the money comes from. So you should really spend a significant amount of time working on playing against recreational players and not just saying, oh, but that's not Pio Solver. Okay? It's very important to understand that. So let me answer a couple of questions and then we'll go to this hand. What's a high one to showdown stat? I would say in most games, like 29 is about average, or is what I would recommend. So I would say like 31 plus is definitely too high. 30 is like the max. Like 30 is loose-ish. And let's say like an N100 game, 31 is definitely too loose. 29 is good. 28 is tight-ish. 27 and below is definitely too tight. Why are one to showdown and one was a flop so important? The reason is that, I mean, every single time you play post flop, that sample is updated, right? So you get a very large sample very quickly. So when it comes to river play, I mean, a lot of the time you don't see the river, so there's not going to be any stats. But when it comes to winning, I mean, when you win on the flop, right? It doesn't mean if you win on the flop, on the turn, on the river. It just shows your overall aggression. So imagine you've got 2,000 hands on somebody, but not many river stats, and you see your opponent has 53 one more off flop. You technically don't know whether or not your opponent is aggressive on the river, right? Because you have no stats. But if your opponent has 53 one more off flop, he's really aggressive, which means that it's pretty likely that he's also aggressive on the river, right? So it encompasses every type of aggression or lack of aggression on the flop and on the turn and on the river, right? And the same goes for one to showdown. As in, if you fold the flop, it means you didn't go to showdown, right? So every time you see a flop, that stat gets updated. So it becomes more accurate very quickly. And if you don't have complete information about everything that happens post flop, you'll still have some information with this stat. So yeah, one was a flop is, in my opinion, one of the top 5 most important stats. VPIP, PFR, 3-bet, one was a flop. In my opinion, these are the most important stats. So when it comes to post flop, one was a flop is the most important stat. And then maybe check raise flop is very important. One to showdown is very important. Those are by far the best ones. The amount of times I've been low called by third pair. Yeah, but be careful, Joe. So don't do anything ridiculous and outplay yourself, right? Any recommendation between Pi and GTO Plus? I've never used GTO Plus, Julian, so I don't know. But I mean, maybe the interface is a bit different, but you'd imagine that if it's GTO software, it doesn't matter if I let my computer or my calculator calculate 1 + 1. The answer should both be 2, right? So if you get a GTO solution, they should be very, very similar anyway. So I don't think it matters too much, unless, let's say, one is much easier to use than the other. We already did this hand. Yes, I know. I think we actually made a bit of a mistake there. Actually, think we copy pasted the same hand twice. That would be but let me answer some of the questions first, and then we come on. Let's yeah. I'm not sure why it keeps on moving. What is a good one to showdown and one was a flop and one to showdown? Okay, I'll explain because it all relates to bet check betting in the anyway. When it comes to one was a flop, I would say around 45 to 51 is good. 48, let's say 48 to 51, I think is best. 52 plus is a bit too aggressive, but I would imagine a lot of you guys have 47 and down, which is too passive. Now, one thing, guys, at lower stakes and in soft games, one was a flop should be a bit on the lower side. Why? I mean, if let's say I play heads up, right, I have one opponent, so I should be winning about half the time. But if, let's say, you play 6-max against very loose players who play a lot of hands and you play against 2 people post-flop, you're only supposed to win about 1/3 of the time. So if, let's say, you have 47 one was a flop and you play on 25 in very loose games, obviously this is different, right? Because you're not supposed to win as much. So for me, if I had, let's say, obviously my opponents don't do a whole lot of cold calling, whatnot. If I had, let's say, 45 one was a flop, I would say that's a leak. If, let's say you play a live game, 9-handed private game, and you have 45 one was a flop, that's okay. Because it's a lot of 4 or 5-handed pots, right? 6-handed pots, who knows? So you're just not going to win half of them. And if that were true, then I would want to get coached by you. Speaking of Pi, how do I find the system requirements to run at a reasonable speed? How do I find them? Well, you can just look that up on your computer, what speeds you need. What I think is you need is a decent amount of RAM. What I did a few years ago is I upgraded my RAM. I had 8 gigs RAM and I upgraded to the 32 and I made a big difference. What you could do is rent a server, but that makes a lot of money. It may cost you a lot of money. Anyway, let's try and stay on topic a little bit, and then we cover the last bits of the session. How many hands do we need for one was a flop and want the showdown to converge? That's a great question, Amar. it's a really good question. You probably need at least 100 samples. And then, so how I do it, Amar, is let's say if I have 100 samples and I see one was a flop of 48, what I'm not going to say, oh, his one was a flop is 48. I'm going to say it's probably between like 45 and like 50, right? So it's definitely not crazy aggressive and it's definitely not crazy passive, so I'm not going to say, okay, exactly 48, right? So maybe he's just run quite badly in those hands, or maybe he's run quite good. But also look at the other stats, Amar. Also look at the VPIP, the PFR, the 3-bet, the check raise. If everything is quite aggressive, then maybe that 48 is a bit lower than it is in actuality, right? So what the point is, guys, use all of these stats and turn it into like a package, right? Use all of those stats together. Great. I just want to make sure so I don't talk for 5 minutes for nothing. Okay, so we've got this hand. It must be 100 NL. So we raise. We're Mr. Alok. So we 3-bet from the small blind versus the cutoff to 1050. That seems fine to me. So on this board, you also have to again think about whether or not you are range checking, right? I would say on 7-5-3. So I have a question: should you be more like? So I'm not saying you should range bet or range check. Should you be more likely to range check this board, or should you be more likely to range check the 9-8-5 board? So just say like this one or the other one. I want to hear from everybody, as always. I want everybody to be engaged. Seeing a lot of good answers. So yeah, you should be more likely to check 9-8-5, right? Because on 9-8-5, Villain will have like 9s and 8s and 6-7 suited for sure, and maybe 9-8 suited and maybe pocket 5s. Whereas here, I mean, he will have 7s for sure and maybe 5s and 3s, but he won't have 6 suited, right? So this board is obviously not a good board for us in the sense that we don't really improve very often. I mean, the only way we improve is with maybe some pocket 7s. That's about maybe some hands like 5-4 suited or ace-5 suited, 6-5 suited, 6-7. But again, not really any great hands. So the point is, on this board, I mean, it's not a good board for us, but it's not a bad one. It's not a really bad one, whereas the other board is really bad. So on this board, I'll be way more willing to have a betting range. We bet the flop, okay. Probably not the sizing I would use. It's okay. There's a lot to talk about there, but okay. On the turn, we check. I'm not a big fan of the check, to be honest. 8-6 suited should not be in Villain's range. So the only hand that now improves is pocket 9s. Obviously, Villain will have pocket 9s 100% of the time, call pre-flop, call flop. But, he also has 10s, jacks, queens, 8s, 8-7, 7-6, flush draws, whatnot. Jack 10 of hearts. And now you end up shoving. Okay. So, and we end up shoving here. Okay, so, and Villain calls with pocket 4, so it feels like ownage. Okay, so here, guys, I think this is a spot where two sizes are most common. The block bet is very common, and the overbet shove. So here, okay, let's say this were a 7-5-3-9 3 run out, right? Shoving would be the most common play, as in there's only 77 in the 53 left. So it's not a gigantic overbet. It's not as if there's like 100 behind, right? And on this river, like, what is there on the 3? Maybe in position occasionally as ace-3 suited, but the point is he doesn't really have much. We know that a lot of villains, let's say this is 100 now, so people play a little bit better now. But a lot of villains don't really check back good stuff too much. So villains range is quite cat. We have a few overpairs that we were going to check shove on the turn, or even check call sometimes, or trap whatnot. And we check them, right? So the point is here, guys, on this river, we have a significant advantage when it comes to big overpairs, right? And so you want to maximize that advantage by having a shoving range, if obviously the bet size allows you to. If we had 150 behind in a pot of 50, obviously it doesn't allow us to shove, right? But for, a little bit over 1.4x pot, now that all of a sudden that's fine. Oh, sorry, he didn't even have that covered. So a bit less than 1.4x pot, that's actually fine. So yeah, I really like it. So here you have to ask, like, how many 5s does he have in position? Some 5-4 suited, some 6-5 suited, some ace-5 suited. So actually that's some, right? I mean, Yeah, I said some 3 times. So let's say ace 5 suited, call pre, call flop, check turn. Okay, that's 2 combos. 5 4 6 5, that's 4 more combos total, but maybe he doesn't always call him pre. So let's say in the end, maybe 4 combos of 5x improve, right? So that's quite a few. But then if let's say you have like aces, now you remove some ace 5 suited combos potentially. So maybe like 4 or 5 combinations. Let's say 4 combinations of a 5 improve. But then he still has a lot of weak bluff catchers, right? Like 4s, 6s, 6 7, 7 8, 8 9, 10 9, 10s, jacks, all that type of stuff. Maybe even a hand like ace king high. So the point is, villain has a lot of very weak bluff catchers. And so we have quite a few hands that are quite strong that we were going to check raise or even check call. And so because we have such a large advantage in terms of the nuts, we'd want to be very aggressive. And as I said, if the river were a 3, we would want to be even more aggressive, right? Because now on the 3, okay, maybe he's got like one combo of ace 3 suited, but he doesn't have like 3 deuce suited or 3 4 suited or king 3 suited, obviously, right? So yeah. So guys, recognize again, if we go back all the way to, if we go back to the presentation, because as you can see, every single time, it's the same fundamentals, right? It's about mixing it up, right? Mixing it up means you're checking aces and kings on the turn sometimes. So you are actually able to make that overbet shove with a value hand, becoming more unpredictable, keeping track of your range, and then how capped am I? How capped is my opponent? In this spot, you saw that he's probably quite capped. Maybe he checks back a set sometimes, but other than that, he doesn't really have much. He is quite capped.